for another ring was made. In the land of Mordor,
The Prince's Bride by S. Morgenstern, Chapter 1. Buttercup was raised on a small farm in the country of Florin.
One essential piece of the foundation of a story is, you guessed it, where does this story take place? This might seem sort of obvious, but the easiest and possibly the only way to create a sense of journey or adventure in a story is to change locations. There are many factors that can determine the feeling of a journey in a story, depending on what kind of locations are used, how long the characters are in those locations, what happens in those locations, and how the location is relevant to the story. In this video, I'm going to go over some examples of all of these to hopefully gain a better understanding of how to utilize location to benefit story, journey, and character development. When I started writing one of my first scripts, I quickly figured out that I could find ways of advancing the plot pretty easily, determining what happens to the main characters at certain points in the story. But a large hurdle I had was figuring out the best locations for where all these events should take place. So these are some observations I've made about location in films that will hopefully help screenwriters think critically about this important element of story. This year, I actually got the opportunity to do some location scouting for a feature film coming out sometime in the next year or so, and it was pretty difficult. But what it showed me the most was that selecting the right locations is a really important part of making your film the way you really want to make it. One of the first things that I would personally say about choosing locations is that you should never put a character somewhere that is not relevant to the story. Even if you just have a scene of characters talking in a room, the location should still complement the scene and overall plot. Where are they? Why are they here? These are questions that the audience is going to be asking in the back of their mind when viewing a scene, and if it's not apparent, it could cause the story to be confusing, which can be intentional to help better tell your story. It's just important to understand the difference between purposefully misleading the audience and doing it on accident. Once you have determined what the location is and why it's relevant to the story, make it perfectly clear that the characters are where you mean for them to be using context clues. This can be in the form of character dialogue, props, using other reference points that were already established earlier in the story, or even blatantly telling the viewer where the scene is taking place by putting text on the screen. Try to inform the viewer in a way that complements the story and style of the film while also keeping them invested. Another thing to keep in mind when scouting locations is screen direction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, but having the right cinematic language can improve a scene drastically. Sometimes a change in location can be jarring, so it's best to minimize inconsistencies for the smoothest transitions between scenes, creating a good cinematic flow. There is always a creative way to convey information to the audience, and I think that's at least a good starting point when thinking about how to make the viewer connect things that are happening on screen to paint a bigger picture. And a large part of doing this effectively is utilizing your locations the best you can. As the writer, you put the characters where they are for a reason. Circumstance influences story, and it should influence your locations the same way. What is happening to your characters at this point in the story? Maybe they find themselves in a sticky situation because the events leading up to this dilemma were not ideal. How does your location convey that? A tight space would be a good choice. Any circumstance that makes the character feel trapped or stuck. Locations carry emotions, whether you mean for them to or not. Wide open spaces feel liberating, while visually clustered environments can seem claustrophobic. However, this is not always the case. Things like context, colors, mood, and sound can alter the feelings of the viewer towards the environment. For example, this enclosed space feels cozy instead of claustrophobic, even though some of the characters clearly don't fit comfortably. Location can be utilized best when it complements the story and clearly shows how it affects the characters. Location should have character. Sometimes, locations are characters. What makes your location unique? If you want the environment to feel familiar throughout the entire story, make most of your locations look similar, or even be the same location. One strong piece of symbolism from the movie Fences is how Troy is so stubborn that he doesn't change at all for his family or loved ones, even though everyone around him wants him to. And this is strongly conveyed by him being in the same backyard for almost the entire movie. always reflecting on his failed career as a baseball player. It's sad, but it does successfully convey what an unchanged man looks like. On the flip side, if you want to create a sense of journey, even if it's not a geographical journey, make sure that your locations have contrast and clear distinctions. Your locations can be used to reflect the position or mood of the character at whatever stage they are in during their story. To the average viewer, what creates a strong sense of journey in a film is when a character or characters are traveling to many different locations, meeting many different people, and discovering new information or gathering new objects along the way. For example, when I think of the different planets in the Star Wars universe, I think of specific events that happened on those planets. Tatooine is where Luke met Obi-Wan, Dagobah is where Luke was trained in the ways of the Jedi, and Cloud City is where Luke first fought Vader. Notice that these are all very different locations. A desert, a swamp, and a city in the clouds. The great distinction between these locations makes it easier for the viewer to separate events in the story so that it doesn't all blend together. It feels like a journey. A film I think is a strong example of both journey and stagnation is The 100-Foot Journey. Every time this chef, Hassan, changes locations, he meets new people, advances in his craft, and develops as a character. Developing strong roots in his own culture's cooking in the beginning, then growing in ambition more and more as the film progresses, and finally, after hitting the peak of his success as a chef, returning home once again, representing all that he has learned over the course of his journey. There are parts where Hassan's family tries to keep him where he is, holding loyalty over his head, and that momentarily slows his progress as a chef and as a character. He realizes that in order to move forward, he has to move on, even if that means working for the restaurant across the street that is in direct competition with his family's restaurant. Even though 100 feet is a short distance geographically, symbolically, it's a large journey for the main character. Now let's move on to using location as a plot device. Sometimes what moves the story along is the search for a specific place. One of the strongest examples of this I can think of is the movie Lion, where a young boy, Saru, growing up in a very small Indian village, gets separated from his brother while they are out looking for work. He falls asleep on a train and travels so far that he is unable to find his way home because of the language barrier and other obstacles that come along with being a small kid in a big world. Eventually, he is adopted by a family in Australia, but he is never able to let go of his past. He knows his mom is still out there wondering where he is. A large part of progressing this story is Saru's fascination with Google Maps. He spends many nights trying to pinpoint where it was he got lost all those years ago by trying to identify landmarks. And eventually, he is able to discover the name of his home village and reunite with his long-lost family. My point is this: if you are going to use location as a plot device, give the viewer a reason to understand why it's important to the characters in the story, and also give the viewer a reason to care. In the scenario of Lion, the locations are important because they are character-driven, which actually keeps the viewer invested instead of just being a fountain of youth type situation. On the opposite side of this subject, let's take the importance of character and story out of the equation of choosing locations for a second. Even without those things, locations convey a lot of feeling and vision because they dictate a large part of the look of your film. Whether you're choosing to shoot in a beautiful paradise or a grungy wasteland, again, locations carry emotion, even without the sentiments of the characters attached to them. Because cinematography is a powerful part of filmmaking, and you have to point a camera someplace. Obviously, choosing locations in accordance with your story is important, but how strongly do the locations stand alone without those things? What messages do they convey visually? Of course, the locations influence the look of your scenes, but another thing to consider is how they influence the sound design. An example of this is the main sort of score in No Country for Old Men, just the minimal sound of wind populating the dry plains of West Texas. This heavily complements the modern Western feel and also contributes to the overall theme that is reflected in the title. The wind provides a consistency throughout the movie that ties together the message that you can't control the future, and there is nothing new that hasn't already been. Evil will happen, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. There are no rules when it comes to writing locations. You can be completely unconventional and tell a unique story. Think of instances like Ready Player One, Inception, Mr. Nobody, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. In these films, locations are kind of fluid, at least in the succession of the storytelling, because of virtual reality, dream diving, alternate universes, and memory erasing. Sometimes characters are not truly where they seem to be, or they jump around instead of just going to one location after another in perfect order. You could make the argument that locations in films are not nearly as important as story and characters, and that's true. But every film I've ever watched has had them. Locations are still an integral part of almost every story ever told, and deserve a lot of thought when it comes to the writing process. What the locations are, how you use them, how they look, what they do for the characters, and how they drive the story. These are all important things to consider as a filmmaker, in my opinion. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It simply tells me what kind of videos you want more of and which ones I should avoid making. Also, if you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. Anyway, my name is JD Thompson, thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.